Roger B. Collins, news and comment. It's Wednesday, June 17th, 2020. Calculated leaks from John Bolton's new Inside the White House book have been published by the Washington Post. The Cowardly Lion is roaring now that it's safe. Now, I realize that with a reference to the Cowardly Lion, I date myself. The Wizard of Oz, for those who are not familiar with it, was an annual ritual, a movie that showed every October, and our family would gather around to watch it again and again. And that, of course, is when the young girl gets blown out of Kansas by a twister and ends up in the Emerald City. And one of the characters she encounters is the Cowardly Lion, who wants to be rough and tough, and he growls, but he's deep down a scaredy cat. And that's how I perceive John Bolton. And as I read these excerpts of what he witnessed inside the Trump administration as the second, or was he third, national security advisor? Third, yes. It's fascinating stuff. And it would have been material to the impeachment, the attempted removal from office of Donald Trump by the House and the Senate that occurred way back in January of 2020. If your memories go that far back, they've been assaulted by the daily barrage of tweets and distractions, so there's no expectation that everybody has, explicit memories of the impeachment attempt. But if John Bolton had agreed to testify before the House committees that investigated and produced the articles of impeachment, or if he had been permitted to testify to the Senate when the wall of red Republicans led by Mitch McConnell, in my view, broke the Constitution by preventing demands for new evidence and testimony from key figures like Johnny Bolton. So we're now learning that Bolton asserts that Trump used his shakedown tactics and tried to enlist foreign leaders to help his re-election efforts, and that these tactics were not limited to Ukraine and the squeezing of Volodymyr Zelensky, the comedian turned president of Ukraine. For example, during a one-on-one meeting with President Xi Jinping of China at the June 2019 Group of 20 summit in Japan, Xi complained to Trump about China critics in the United States. And Bolton says Trump immediately assumed that Xi meant the Democrats. Trump said approvingly that there was great hostility among the Democrats toward China. He then stunningly turned the conversation to the coming U.S. presidential election, alluding to China's economic capability to affect the ongoing campaigns, pleading with Xi to ensure that he, Trump, would win. He stressed the importance of farmers and increased Chinese purchases of soybeans and wheat, affecting the electoral outcome. And Bolton says, I would print Trump's exact words, but the government's pre-publication review process has decided otherwise. At the same meeting, Xi also defended China's construction of camps, some called them re-education camps or concentration camps, housing up to 1 million Uyghur Muslims in the far western province of Xinjiang. And Trump signaled his approval. This becomes important in our next story here today. According to our interpreter, Bolton writes, Trump said that Xi should go ahead with building the camps, which Trump thought was exactly the right thing to do. So the book is called The Room Where It Happened, a White House memoir, and it is due to be published next week. In a moment, we will recap briefly the legal maneuvers the White House is engaged in to prevent publication of the book, but I think that the water is over the dam, so to speak. It's almost 600 pages, It portrays Trump as an erratic and stunningly uninformed commander-in-chief, lays out a series of jarring and troubling encounters between the president, his top advisors, and foreign leaders. Bolton describes the book as being based on both contemporaneous accounts and his own notes. The request for electoral assistance from China is one of many instances described by Bolton in which Trump seeks favors or approval from authoritarian leaders. Many of those same leaders were also happy to take advantage of the U.S. president and attempt to manipulate him, Bolton says, often through simplistic appeals to his various obsessions. For example, in one May 2019 phone call, President Putin of Russia compared Venezuela's opposition leader Juan Guaido to Hillary Clinton. And I don't know exactly how that is detailed, but it's part of what Bolton terms a brilliant display of Soviet-style propaganda to shore up support for the Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro. Putin's claims, Bolton says, largely persuaded Trump. Well, I would need more details and context because Juan Guaido is a cartoon figure. And as a fellow cartoon figure, I think Trump would know one when he sees one. In another example, May 2018, Bolton says Turkish President Erdogan handed Trump a memo claiming innocence for a Turkish firm under investigation by the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York for violating Iranian sanctions. Trump then told Erdogan he'd take care of it, explaining that those prosecutors weren't his people, they were Obama people, and that would be fixed in short order. Bolton says he was so alarmed by Trump's determination to do favors for autocrats like Erdogan and Xi that he scheduled a meeting with Attorney General Barr in 2019 to discuss the president's behavior. And Bolton says that Barr agreed he was worried too, at least about the appearances created by Trump's behavior. Bolton broadly confirms the outline of the impeachment case laid out by Democratic lawmakers in the House proceedings, writing that Trump was fixated on a bogus claim that Ukraine tried to hurt him and was enthralled to unfounded conspiracy theories pushed by Rudy Giuliani and others. Trump was impeached before being acquitted by the GOP-controlled Senate. Bolton resisted Democratic calls to testify without a subpoena. And that is such bullshit. Here he is grandstanding as a principled critic of Trump. And when the moment arose, he refused to cooperate in an effort that could have cascaded into actually bringing such embarrassment and revelation of wrongdoing to Trump. And I know it's a little far-fetched, but the Senate actually could have felt they had no other choice but to remove him. But the cowardly lion is content to sell a bunch of books and sell out our country. And Trump, for other reasons, has referred to Bolton as a traitor, and I have to say that word drifted through my consciousness as I read these excerpts from the book. And he affirms what other tell-all books have said, that privately the most loyal advisors of Trump hold a dim view of him, that in one case he asked Chief of Staff John Kelly if Finland is part of Russia. When he met Prime Minister Theresa May in 2018, a British official referred to the United Kingdom as a nuclear power, and Trump said, "Oh, are you a nuclear power?" And Bolton rushes to add that it was clear that was not intended as a joke. So this is quite revealing. He also says that Mike Pompeo, who's still playing Secretary of State, listened in on a phone call between South Korea's president and Trump just ahead of the Singapore summit with Kim Jong-un, that Pompeo said he was having cardiac arrest in Saudi Arabia, where he monitored the call. And Bolton said He described it as a near-death experience. But when it comes down to it, these people protect their own jobs and their own butts over the interests of the country that they profess so much reverence for. So yesterday, the Trump administration asked a federal judge to block publication of this book. They're claiming it still has national security information in it that can't be printed. But they're going to lose, and the book, I believe, will be published on schedule next week. And this is where we pick up the quote that Trump reportedly called Bolton a traitor to many people when he left the administration. So Mike Pompeo is meeting today in Hawaii with his counterpart from China, the foreign policy chief Yang Jiechi. And tensions could not be greater. The U.S. has blamed China for bungling the response to the coronavirus, not sharing information with the United States. The U.S. is upset about the protests, some against the United States, some against Beijing, that have been occurring in Hong Kong. And there are tensions over the mutual expulsion of journalists from each country. And to underscore the tensions, each side has said that it was the other who requested this meeting in Hawaii. There are also the tensions that are developing now between China and India. We'll touch on that in a moment. But unlike his boss, Pompeo has publicly excoriated China for its repression of human rights, including the Uyghur Muslims, that Trump said, it's okay. Lock them up, discriminate against them. And so Pompeo has no credibility on that issue when Trump has already undercut him. Also, the U.S. wants to persuade China to raise issues related to nuclear arms negotiations between the U.S. and Russia, trying to turn it into a three-way agreement, but China is not interested. And what credibility do we have? Trump has repeatedly pulled out of agreements, starting with the Paris Accord, then the Iranian nuclear deal, then the intermediate missile treaty with Russia. And I believe the Chinese do have the upper hand. One of the interesting things on television last night, I was watching MSNBC, zipping through some commercials on my DVR, and there was a minute-long commercial from the Trump campaign demonizing Joe Biden for his cozy ties with China. Now, Biden is somebody I criticize routinely, but he has postured as not so warm and fuzzy toward China, at least for this election cycle. And at least we can say that he didn't dangle any deals with China to help himself get elected. Yes, you can hear my faint praise there. So the showdown on the border of China and India, where we know that at least 20 Indian troops were killed, China is not confirming any casualties on its side. But President Xi and Prime Minister Modi of India are talking strong bluster. Modi, the sovereignty and integrity of India is supreme. Nobody can stop us in defending that. The sacrifice of our soldiers will not be in vain. India wants peace, but if provoked, India is capable of giving a befitting reply. And this clash, described as the worst in 45 years between these two neighbors, drew this response from a retired colonel in the People's Liberation Army of China. This kind of provocation is aggressive. We have no choice but to contain it. China is willing to go head-to-head with it and isn't afraid of deaths or even of opening fire. And it is unusual that the fight that left 20 Indians dead involved no arms. It was fisticuffs, rock throwing, the use of sticks or batons. So I guess there is the potential for escalation. We have another border-crossing military action, this time Turkey, crossing over into Iraq with a ground and air operation that targeted 150 positions that are suspected to be controlled by the Kurdish group, the PKK. And I have long argued that when Obama invited Turkey to join the scrum in Syria, that it was a big mistake because Turkey's agenda is merely eviscerating the Kurds. And there are a couple of different, sections or cells of Kurds. And Turkey, which has had a long internal struggle with certain Turkish groups, considers them basically all the same. And apparently Iran joined in the fun. Iranian artillery fire on PKK hideouts in a border region Tuesday added to speculation that this week's military action was a complex, internationally coordinated maneuver. When Turkey aligns with Iran, well, that puts them sideways with the inexplicable U.S. foreign policy, which looks for any excuse to get into a confrontation with Iran. So at the UN Human Rights Council meeting in Geneva, Switzerland, one of the major topics is racism in the United States. And on a certain level, this is pretty humiliating. And on another level, it will invoke American exceptionalism. Trump has already said that we are no longer participating with the Human Rights Council over its respectful treatment of Israel. When I say respectful, I mean respecting international law. And so the agenda is to set up a commission of inquiry, the most powerful tool that they have to inspect human rights violations, to look into systemic racism and abuses against Africans and people of African descent in the United States. The symbol of systemic racism has become emblematic of the excessive use of disproportionate force by law enforcement against people of African descent, against people of color, and against indigenous peoples and racial and ethnic minorities in many countries, said Michelle Bachelet, who is the chair of the commission. Behind today's racial violence, systemic racism, and discriminatory policing lies the failure to acknowledge and confront the legacy of the slave trade and colonialism. That's a reality check that Americans really need to pay attention to. And here is an interesting angle on racism that might not be a consideration for mainstream Americans. And this is an op-ed in today's New York Times under the byline of Mustafa Bayoumi. He's the author of How Does It Feel to Be a Problem Being Young and Arab in America? And he asked the question, was racism, tensions between Muslims and blacks in Minneapolis, the underlying reason that the cops were called when George Floyd allegedly tried to pass a counterfeit $20 bill at a little grocery store called Cup Foods? He was buying cigarettes, if you recall. Well, the owner of Cup Foods, whose name is Mahmoud Abumayale, was away when a 17-year-old worker made the call to the police. The store said it's a state policy that requires retailers to notify the police about counterfeit bills, describing the practice as standard protocol. And this follows many lawsuits that municipalities have used to close businesses under commercial nuisance abatement laws. Back in 2001, Cup Foods was caught in a nuisance abatement case. So it's possible that this young 17-year-old clerk or cash register operator had been instructed to call the police because we don't want to be called a nuisance. And in recognition that this is a policy that basically forces the deputization of unwilling people as police liaisons, in 2017, the New York City Council limited the use of nuisance abatement statute after it became clear that the wide and disproportionate usage of this law has negatively impacted law-abiding New Yorkers and New Yorkers of color in particular. That's something I had never thought of. So the former Atlanta officer who killed Rayshard Brooks last Friday night at the Wendy's in Atlanta, turns out that Garrett Rolfe, back in 2015, along with two other officers, were involved in an incident that they covered up. They opened fire on a man they thought was driving a stolen truck. His name is Jackie Jermaine Harris. But the shooting was not reported by the officers involved, and Mr. Harris is an African American who was wounded after being shot at several times inside this truck. His lung was collapsed, and he was hospitalized. But the police report didn't mention any of that. They said that he was injured without any description of how or the extent of the injuries. And the judge who presided over a 2016 court hearing called the case a disaster, said it's the wildest case I've seen in my 34 years on the bench. And the judge, Doris Downs, complained none of the police put in the report that they shot the man, none of them. And they sent him to Grady, a hospital with collapsed lungs and everything, and the report doesn't mention it. I am ethically going to be required to turn all of them in. Apparently she did, and nothing happened. So this speaks to the need for uniform reporting on the use of force by police officers. And in an empty gesture yesterday, Trump signed an executive order that, among other things, calls for the establishment of a database on police use of force. And today, Senate Republicans included a similar provision in their own reform bill. But get this, the FBI, under previous reforms, the ones that Obama never did, the FBI launched the National Use of Force Data Collection Project last year. But they only got cooperation from 40% of the some 18,000 law enforcement agencies across the country. So Trump's order does say that federal funds should be withheld if a police department doesn't submit its data. So on the face of it, it does the requirement for the information. But it's just statistics, all right? Here's an FBI spokeswoman. The goal of this collection is not to offer insight into single incidents, but to provide a comprehensive view of the circumstances, subjects, and officers involved in use of force incidents nationwide. So this is another one of those moves that when you hear about it, okay, we've got a database. But will it include data that is really meaningful? Or is it just an out-of-context collection of numbers that won't mean much and won't lead to any true transparency? I want to recommend an op-ed that I saw at The Guardian today under the byline of Moira Donegan. I've read her before, and she's a smart woman. I've linked to this in the show file for today's podcast. It's headlined, "Who Will Protect You from Rape Without Police?" And she notes that some feminists and victims of sexual assault have raised the question that if we, quote unquote, abolish the police, then who is going to protect us? Who is going to sexual crimes? But Donegan writes, the notion that abolishing the police will have negative repercussions for women radically misunderstands both American policing and sexual violence. Police abolition need not be considered an abdication of the responsibility to protect women, but rather a way to fulfill it. According to the Rape and Incest National Network, a little less than 25% of sexual assaults are reported to police. The reasons are many, but an often cited one is distrust and fear of the police. One survey of sex assault survivors found that of those who chose not to report, 15% feared that the police could not or would not do anything to help. An additional 7% didn't want to expose their attacker. And Donegan writes, there's ample evidence that sexual assault victims who distrust the police are correct. Women who do report assaults often encounter cops who are incompetent, contemptuous, or indifferent. And we know that there is a backlog. Conservative estimates indicate that American police departments have 200,000 untested rape kits in their possession. And think of the additional pain that a rape victim faces. Going to the police, being sent to a clinic or a hospital to have evidence taken from the body parts that were just freshly violated. And then to know that there's serious, that physical evidence will never be examined. Police departments, this is Donegan again, systemically fail to make arrests in sex assault cases. Their failures are mirrored throughout the justice system. According to this organization, RAIN, only 4.6% of sexual assaults ever lead to an arrest, and only 0.9% are ever referred by police to prosecutors. Yeah, that's 1%. Would you submit? Would you trust the police when 99% of cases go nowhere? Then there is the all too often instance of police officers using their power to force women to have sex with them, sometimes while they're on duty. And Donegan concludes the police have proven that they are no allies of women's rights. A large, unaccountable group of primarily men empowered to commit violence to maintain existing hierarchies of power is not going to end the scourge of sexual violence against women. As feminists, we must recognize that the police are more likely to hurt women than to help us. Two journalists, a photographer and a writer for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, are sounding their objections to being kept from covering protests against racism and police violence. The photographer, a Pulitzer Prize winner, Michael Santiago, has left the paper. He took a buyout. And a reporter who was supported by Santiago, named Alexis Johnson, remains there, but she is suing the newspaper. Santiago said, I didn't see them trying to find a way to alleviate the situation at all. I just can't work for a place that does this. So at issue is that Johnson was denied a request to cover the protests because in a tweet that she posted on May 31st, she included photographs of a trash-filled parking lot in Pittsburgh after concerts by a white country singer. And she tweaked her tweet by saying, horrifying scenes and aftermath from selfish looters who don't care about this city. Oh, wait, sorry. No, these are pictures from a Kenny Chesney concert tailgate. So the editors claim that that showed bias on her part, and they assigned her to other coverage. Well, say goodbye and observe the retirement of Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben. Quaker Oats, owned by Pepsi now, has decided to retire Aunt Jemima, who is depicted as a black woman on syrup and pancake mix. And Uncle Ben, which has been using an ethnic or Asian ethnic stereotype for years. Uncle Ben's is now owned by Mars, the candy company, and they are going to discontinue the use of his image and the name Uncle Ben's. And the NFL seems to be warming up a little bit to Colin Kaepernick and his possible return if the NFL ever plays again. I don't know what the season might look like if there is one. But with my own ears, I heard Roger Goodell mention Colin Kaepernick's name, say that he would look favorably on a team hiring cap. The Seahawks coach, Pete Carroll, says he's heard from at least one team interested in signing Kaepernick. And the coach for the Los Angeles Chargers, Anthony Lynn, says teams would be crazy not to look at Colin Kaepernick. So that's a real change. And there are other issues. He hasn't played in a long time. He had an uneven record with the San Francisco 49ers even before he took a knee. And so we shall see how it plays out. As you may know, we've got the Peter B. Collins Podcast Community Fund, and we are handing out grants of $100 to people who contact me who can use a little extra help at this difficult time. And today we're sending $100 to Kiara Thomas. She writes, I lost my job as a nanny in March. I haven't been able to go back since. I hope to find a job as soon as things ease here, but my searches have not been successful yet. So she can use $100, and we're going to send that to her today by PayPal, as she has requested. And you could be next. If you could use $100 to pay a bill, to fill your gas tank, to buy groceries. I recognize that many people have fallen through the cracks, that the $1,200, if you got it, I'm sure has already been spent. Many people, for different reasons, didn't qualify for the expanded unemployment benefits. And there are a lot of people who were out of the economy already when the recession, which is likely to turn into a depression, hit these shores. I also want to remind you that we don't limit this geographically to the U.S. of A. If you're one of my offshore listeners, you are welcome to submit a request for a grant. Email Peter at peterbcollins.com. Well, the last couple of days we've talked about the episode in Albuquerque, where protesters wanted to take down the statue of the conquistador. Armed vigilantes, calling themselves the New Mexico Civil Guard, showed up. And they are still claiming that the shooter who fired on a protester, apparently after being whacked with a 2x4, wielded by the protester, his name is Stephen Baca. He is the son of the former sheriff of Bernalillo County. He's 31 years old. And it's not clear still if he was an actual member of the so-called New Mexico Civil Guard or they just decided to protect him from the protesters after he opened fire. But this report from The Guardian also details the other armed vigilante groups in New Mexico. It's a hotbed. There is the United Constitutional Patriots, who made news in 2019 after heavily armed members detained hundreds of undocumented asylum seekers crossing into the U.S. On June 5th of this year, armed members of the True Patriot Foundation were seen patrolling businesses in Gallup, New Mexico. We also learned that some of these groups are considered by local police to be heavily armed friendlies, so they have tacit approval. Then we have another militia group, the American Patriots of New Mexico, And a member named Robert Whitman is quoted here saying that the group had coordinated with Albuquerque police to patrol protests for many years. I didn't know the extent of that activity in the state of New Mexico. Meanwhile, the armed Air Force military policeman, Sergeant Stephen Carrillo, age 32, he is now accused of 2 fatal shootings, one of a federal security guard in Oakland during one of the protests there on May 29th, and then the June 6th killing of a Santa Cruz sheriff's deputy. And now we're learning that Carrillo considers him a follower of the Boogaloo movement, and he enlisted the other suspect in the case, Robert Justice, who apparently only met Carrillo on the day of the shooting in Oakland. He says Carrillo picked him up at, I think, a BART station. Then they went to Oakland. The details are that Justice got out of the van and cased the joint, then got back in the van and drove up so that Carrillo could open the sliding door, fire off a couple of shots, and then Justice, the getaway driver, quickly left. And one of the investigators, an FBI special agent, Jack Bennett, says there's no evidence that these men had any intention to join the demonstrations in Oakland. They came to Oakland to kill cops. So as he was being hunted down at his home in the Santa Cruz Mountains in the redwood-infested community of Ben Lomond, and I used to, when I first came to California, I lived a mile away in Boulder Creek. Well, Carrillo used his own blood to write messages on the hood of a car that he attempted to hijack. The statements were, "Boog, I became unreasonable," and "Stop the duopoly." And the message is a little bit muddled here because the accounts of their Facebook posts indicated that they're kind of in a libertarian zone, and the politics are secondary to their ties to the Boogaloo movement and an effort to gin up a fresh civil war here in the United States. So while I was reviewing that article, I recalled a song from the, I think it's from the 60s, called Boogaloo Down Broadway. And I couldn't remember who did the song, so I looked it up on Spotify. And it's the fantastic Johnny C. Wait a minute. Well, I just lost Johnny C. because my thumb on my iPad here hit another song. Anyway, I was kind of humming Boogaloo Down Broadway, and then I noticed in the Spotify search results there is a playlist called Boogaloo Tunes. And it was put together by J. Smith 266. It has almost 1,300 likes, and it includes such songs as Seven Nation Army by the White Stripes, Killing in the Name by Rage Against the Machine, Run Through the Jungle, Fight for Your Right by the Beastie Boys, I Won't Back Down by Johnny Cash, Guns N' Roses, Welcome to the Jungle. And what is John Denver doing in here? Take Me Home, Take Me Home, Country Roads? That's a Boogaloo anthem? Gimme Shelter, Purple Haze, For What It's Worth by Buffalo Springfield, Break On Through, Don't Fear the Reaper, I Think I'm Paranoid by Garbage, Runnin' with the Devil by Van Halen. Now, some of this is just, a rockin' kind of song. But it's part of a playlist called Boogaloo Tunes. And that is a movement that I think is not going to fade away anytime soon. Here's today's COVID-19 update, edited by Linda Lewis. Worldwide, we have 8.2 million cases reported with 444,000 deaths. The United States, 2.1 million cases. The death count is up to 117,000. And as we mentioned yesterday, the projection with the kind of loosened behavior by Americans is that it could hit 200,000 by October. Yesterday, Texas recorded a new daily high in hospitalizations and positive COVID-19 tests. And the governor, Greg Abbott, at a news conference said, if you do not need to go out, the best advice still is to stay at home. Abbott said hospitals have plenty of capacity. The state is moving along with reopening, allowing restaurants to use 75% of their capacity now, and most businesses to operate at 50%. Mike Pence is peddling blue sky. He wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal, widely derided since it was published yesterday. He called the administration's handling of the pandemic a success and a cause for celebration. Huh? Okay. He also says concerns about a second wave of coronavirus are overblown. He pointed to overall cases stabilizing over the past 2 weeks, with the daily average case rate across the U.S. dropping to 20,000, and that deaths are down to fewer than 750 a day. I don't believe that's true. I think the death count is almost 1,000 a day nationally. And Anthony Fauci, who's been sidelined by the White House, he told the Journal that increased testing does result in more cases reported, but that higher percentages of positive results in many states cannot be explained just by the expansion of testing. He warned that the relaxed approaches to social distancing, such as congregating close to lots of people in large venues, will cause the disease to spread. And when asked if he would go to the Trump rally in Tulsa this week, he said, no, he said, personally, I would not. And he said that we're still in the first wave, so the talk of a second wave is premature. And as I've said before, the media really owe us some honest statistics about this, because they don't present the number of positive test results reported with the number of tests conducted per 100,000 or some other per capita standard. And without that, a lot of these numbers are just numbers. CNN's Sanjay Gupta says, this may seem counterintuitive, but if you're doing enough testing, cases should start to go down because you're finding people early before they spread it. And related to the Tulsa party, the mob rally this weekend, Pence claimed that Oklahoma has flattened the curve. But that is not true. And Gupta says that in Oklahoma, cases have been increasing while testing has actually been cut back a little bit. Thousands of nursing homes across the country have not been checked to see if staff are following proper procedures to prevent transmission of the virus. The House committee overseeing the federal response has launched an investigation into the 5 largest for-profit nursing home companies. And Democrat James Clyburn of South Carolina, who chairs the panel, sent letters to the Federal Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services and the 5 companies seeking information about whether they have been properly managed by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And I think this is a huge vulnerability that we have not properly paid attention to. After all, the first major outbreak was in Washington State, outside Seattle, where a cluster of cases led to deaths at a nursing home. 44 to 46% of the fatalities linked to COVID nationwide have occurred in nursing homes. I'll also point out that so far we are not seeing a rise in infections and positive testing and hospitalizations related to the massive protests that hit virtually every community in the United States over the past 3 weeks. There is a new outbreak, and it is spreading in Beijing. The number was 36 the last time we checked in. It's now 137. An additional 31 reported on Wednesday. And Beijing has started a somewhat scaled-down version of the restrictions that they enforced earlier this year. A lot of flights have been canceled because people have been canceling their reservations, or at least that's what we are told. And here in the United States, prisons and jails are the scene of serious infection spreading. The number of prison inmates known to be infected has doubled during the past month to more than 68,000. Deaths tied to the coronavirus have risen by 73% since mid-May. The 5 largest known clusters are not at nursing homes or meatpacking plants, but inside correctional institutions. And that's a situation that we do have much more control over. But, of course, there's a deep bias against prisoners. They are subhuman. And they get what they deserve, right? And speaking of that, Bill Barr, getting bloodthirsty, has announced that the federal government will set new dates to begin executing death row inmates. As soon as mid-July, Danny Lee, convicted in Arkansas of killing a family of 3. Wesley Perkey of Kansas, convicted of raping and murdering a 16-year-old girl. Dustin Lee Honkin, who killed 5 people in Iowa. And Keith Nelson, who kidnapped a 10-year-old girl in front of her Kansas home and raped her behind a church before he killed her. Those little snippets probably caused some people to say, oh, okay, those are disposable bad guys. But fundamentally, state-sponsored killing is murder. And we've enjoyed a moratorium for many years, but in an effort to seek votes from hardliners, Trump, of course, is using this for political purposes. Now, this guy didn't get the death sentence, but the former CEO of Bumblebee Tuna, Chris Leszewski, was sentenced to more than 3 years in prison for his role in a price-fixing racket. Now, this is so rare. Yesterday, we told you about PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric, pleading guilty to 84 separate charges of manslaughter for the 84 people who were killed by its negligence from the high-powered transmission line that was almost 100 years old when it failed and burned Paradise, California. Now they're imposing fines on the company, but no executives at PG&E will be fined or face jail time. But District Judge Edward Chen imposed a $100,000 fine on Leszewski, in addition to 40 months in the federal penitentiary. The pandemic has been used to delay processing legitimate citizenship applications. The backlog is now 650,000. And this does not appear to be accidental, because as soon as you become a citizen, the final step is the mass swearing-in ceremonies. You are eligible to vote. And statistics show that new citizens, by and large, vote Democratic. And so in states like Florida, Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Texas, back in 2018, nearly 200,000 immigrants became citizens in those 4 states. So once again, politics being presented as, a response to the pandemic. But the ultimate goal is to prevent people from voting. It's another suppression scheme. Facebook has announced 2 initiatives. One, the largest voting information effort in U.S. history, aiming to help 4 million Americans register to vote with a new voting information center. And separately, Facebook has announced that individual users will now be able to turn off all social issue, electoral, and political ads, meaning that Trump and Brad Parscale, his digital guru, won't be able to talk to you. Now, I think that's interesting because on the one hand, Facebook talks about how they want to promote engagement. And to me, it's not about Trump's ads. Facebook is the cheapest way for your local progressive candidate to build name ID and to communicate with you on issues that you share with that candidate. So it'd be one thing if I could select the Trump campaign and say, I don't want to receive any messages. But when people block them all out, I think that reduces the voters' knowledge before they go to the polls. And I just got to interject here that there's something wrong over at Twitter. Because after, mildly disciplining Trump for his looting and shooting tweet and his lies about the impact of voting by mail, 3 different mornings. That's the only time I look at my phone and I see these Twitter alerts. Twitter is intentionally feeding me Donald Trump tweets. I don't follow him. These aren't retweets from people I know. These are served to me by Facebook and, by Twitter. And, even though I don't use Twitter that much, I tweet my daily podcast. They know the headlines of that, linked to my name, my account. Why are they feeding me Trump tweets? If anybody knows, please share your knowledge. Interesting column by LA Times columnist Michael Hiltzik in the paper today related to the wrangling over oversight of the trillions of dollars handed out by the federal Treasury under the CARES Act. And as you know, Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary at Trump's bidding, is saying that he won't disclose the names of businesses receiving loans through the Paycheck Protection Program. The White House Office of Management and Budget instructed executive branch agencies they don't have to disclose any more information about the business grants. But the CARES Act explicitly requires much more disclosure, including information about how the receiving businesses plan to use the money. And so the Times columnist quotes Neil Barofsky, who oversaw spending in the 2008 bank bailout. He said government officials don't want to share information because they're worried it will be politically harmful or show failures in the program. But get this, because Hiltzik adds that one of the reasons the Oversight Committee is not operational is that Speaker Pelosi and Majority Leader McConnell have not taken the final step. They've each appointed 4 members, but the chair of the commission has not been selected, and until that happens, the commission cannot operate. They can't hire staff. They can't have any meaningful meetings, even on Zoom. And so both sides hold responsibility for the failure of that to develop. I've gotten to know John Kiriakou a little bit since he got out of prison. He's the former CIA officer who is called a whistleblower because he confirmed what everybody knew, which is that the U.S. tortured people. And he took a guilty plea to a single charge of violating the Intelligence Identities Protection Act. He was sentenced to 30 months. I think he did 24 in a prison in Pennsylvania. And he has told me offline that episode led to the breakup of his marriage. And he was married to Heather Kiriakou. And I believe Heather worked at the agency too. I don't know that for a fact, but I think it's true. She is now a business development officer for the huge defense contractor Northrop Grumman. So at some point after The marriage broke up. John Kiriakou discovered that his wife was involved in an affair with another Northrop executive. So in July of 2018, he contacted the ethics office at Northrop to inform them that he had documents showing that Heather, director of global business development, and an executive fraudulently billed the company for business travel, when in fact they were engaging in tens of thousands of dollars of personal travel that involved cheating on John Kiriakou. So then the ethics office instructed John to transmit the documents he claimed he had. One of them, at least, was a photo that Heather had sent to her alleged paramour of her in a bikini with a thong bottom. Now, based on that description, I don't think you would call that any kind of porn. But John now stands accused, he has been accused, of trafficking in revenge porn when he sent that photo to the ethics department at Northrop Grumman. This led to a raid on his house last October 2019. They searched his person, vehicles, his computers. They took the scooter that he had had an accident on, if you remember that story, and impounded it for 3 weeks. The charges were dismissed this past March 16th. But a judge in that proceeding barred John Kiriakou from seeing 3 children that he had with Heather. I believe he has a total of 6 or 7 children, but these 3 he is not permitted to have contact with right now. So Kiriakou is seeking damages for severe emotional distress, including loss of contact with his kids, acute depression requiring psychiatric care, and alienation from friends and professional colleagues. Wow. I've linked to the details in the story that I just cited over at Shadowproof, written by the great young reporter Kevin Gostola. And finally today, I want to recommend a piece over at Consortium News under the byline of Elizabeth Voss. She is another bright young reporter who I have a lot of respect for. And she has reviewed all 4 hours of the Netflix documentary about Jeffrey Epstein called Jeffrey Epstein, Filthy Rich, and another doc, a 3-hour special that I wasn't aware of, called Who Killed Jeffrey Epstein. And she details what is in these 2 video packages. I've watched only the first episode of the Filthy Rich series. There are 4 altogether, I believe. But Voss does a great job of pointing out that neither one of these documentaries will touch the most important information about Jeffrey Epstein. And she cites the former Israeli intelligence officer Ari Ben-Menashe, who said Epstein didn't work with Mossad. He worked with Israel's military intelligence, along with Robert Maxwell, the infamous British publisher who died when he slipped off the back of his yacht in the Mediterranean. And, of course, Jeffrey Epstein was very close. They were described as girlfriend and boyfriend. And then Ghislaine, I've been mispronouncing her name Ghislaine, which is more phonetic. But Ghislaine, the daughter of Robert Maxwell, became the procurer of young girls for her former lover, Mr. Epstein. But what the documentaries fail to report, oh, sure, they talk about Prince Andrew. They talk about the Lolita Express. They show pictures of Epstein's private island, his mansion in New Mexico, one of the biggest townhouses in New York City that was given to him by one of his big mentors, if you will, and that is Wexner. Wexner is the founder of The Limited and Victoria's Secret. So the absence of coverage of the intelligence connections of Epstein and Ms. Maxwell, which have been reported, and we've shared that here, the great work of Whitney Webb, formerly at Mint Press. That stuff gets left on the cutting room floor. And so they are content to share the salacious details of his ongoing exploitation of hundreds of young girls. And there is a titillating and, voyeur aspect to that as entertainment. But they're not willing to really dig in and tell Americans that Jeffrey Epstein ran a blackmail operation and that he was often in cahoots with the military intelligence of the State of Israel. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube, and I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling